Welcome to the Ranch Workforce Project, a limited series collaboration between the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance and Montana State University's Dan Scott Ranch Management Program, a project to address the domestic labor shortage on farms and ranches, a project to replenish the pipeline, a project to attract new people into an old industry, a project to face what has to change from within. Because the future of agriculture doesn't just depend on land and livestock, it depends on people. And now, your host, Haylie Shipp.
Well, you prospected well, you hired well, you onboarded just right, and then the employee left. Back to the drawing board. It's a frustration that many employers know. And as we talk about it in the case of agriculture, that revolving door equates to hours not spent working on or working in the ranch. Welcome to the Ranch Workforce Project. I'm your host, Haylie Shipp, joined today again by co-host Rachel Frost. Now, today's discussion is that great ranches don't just hire good people, but they can also keep them. Chris Redman is along for the ride as we talk about ranch culture, leadership, and how to pay attention to what employees need, using this all to turn a demanding ranch lifestyle into a place where people really want to actually build a career. So with that, let's go ahead and get into these introductions. Chris, we'll dive into workplace culture and retention. We'll get some definitions to those today. But before we get there, why don't you let our listener know a bit more about your background?
Yeah, so I grew up in a small town in Eastern Washington and around agriculture, but I didn't grow up near ranching at all, really. And so after spending 4 years in the military, I decided that I wanted to get into ranching. And so I spent a little bit of time going to school at the University of Idaho and got a bachelor's degree there. And then over a period of several years, I decided I wanted to get my master's degree in cowboying. And so I cowboyed all over the Great Basin and just worked on some big ranches, small ranches, and really fell in love with, the ranching lifestyle. And so I got to see a lot of things from the ground up. And then at a certain point, a mentor of mine encouraged me to go to the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management. And so I applied to get into there and started there in 2012 and graduated in 2014. And from there, I ended up with Turner Enterprises for about 7 years in a couple different roles, one as a ranch manager on 2 different ranches, and then also in human resources, which was a big change, doing recruiting and training for the company. After Turner's, I spent a couple years with Aramo Ensign Ranches and managed a large unit up there, which was about 3,500 cows and backgrounding a lot in some farming. And then I spent about a year and a half with Ag West Farm Credit as a loan officer there. And so today I'm currently self-employed as a farrier and do some day work and sell some molasses.
Well, Rachel, as we get into this conversation of, how to keep ranch employees, one of the big words here that we're using is culture and workplace culture. That's sort of a corporate type term, culture. And so we all know it from what, rural Montana might have or rural America and culture of our small communities. But Rachel, can you kind of define what workplace culture means as we're talking about it today?
Sure, Haylie. In my opinion, the simplest form workplace culture is how it feels when you're at work. What is that atmosphere there? Do you feel valued? Is your employer or your employee making you feel like you're part of a team and it feels like that you have something to contribute besides just the hard work and the muscles that you bring? Part of that is just feeling like you're hired for more than just the neck down, that somebody wants to know that you have something to contribute to that as far as a thought process, but really, does it feel like a good place to come to work? Are you happy to be at work? Do you feel comfortable while you're there? All of those things that contribute to employee satisfaction.
So, Chris, as we're looking at this from a perspective of hiring individuals on a ranch, could be, a farm, could be a myriad of different operations in agriculture, but a lot of what we discuss here is just ranching with Rachel and my background. What is a good retention period? What's a normal retention period? What are we aiming for? Because It's not very often that you're going to get an employee who signs on at age 24 and sticks with you until they retire.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think, it is all over the board. You see people lasting, a few days, which of course is not normal. And then you see other people lasting, 20 or 30 years on a place. And that really isn't that normal either. And I would say, a good target is probably, between 5 and 10 years. In today's world, people are pretty mobile and, there's just certain lifestyle changes that happen. And so, you are going to see some movement. I think, when you're less than 5 years, you can't pay that back very quickly. And so, that 5 to 10 years, and sometimes after 10 years, you're getting maybe people getting a little bit too used to it and, getting complacent. And so, I think there is, some level of, maybe too long as well.
Well, as we continue this discussion today, we're going to talk about people wanting more than a paycheck. And this is that element of things that really keeps people attracted to and in a job, still feeling challenged, still feeling valued. The paycheck is nice. We all need that, couple that with all of the conversations that I have with good friends that say, if it weren't for the benefits, we'd be here or, we'd leave. But I know Rachel has it lined out where we're going to discuss some of those things later on in the podcast. So we're really talking about those pieces that are beyond the paycheck today, beyond the benefits, what it feels like to actually be in this job. So, Chris, start us out. Let's kind of start to define and cultivate what a good atmosphere feels like in the ranching world to attract and then also retain those employees.
Yeah, so I mean, we talked about culture, just a minute ago, and I think, one of the most important things to start off with is that a company has to be able to define that culture. Like, what is the culture that they want to propagate and cultivate? And so, when you think about that, some places use a lot of ATVs, and other places are strictly horseback. Some places are expecting you to jump on a tractor and help farm, and other places, you know, aren't. And so, and there's a lot of places that are more concerned about environmental stewardship. And so you really need to define, what your culture is so that you get the right people there. And so and the reason I bring that up is because when you get to a place that you don't align with, then you don't feel comfortable and you're all feeling like you don't belong. And so I think that that's really important is to try to find the people that match up with the culture that you're trying to create. And so I think that's really important. But what it feels like, is that you're happy to go to work. You're excited to be there. You don't feel threatened like by, someone else, putting you down or, getting after you for, every little thing. You feel like, you're part of a team and that, when correction does come, it's coming in a way that helps you to get better. And so I think, you know, the expectation, lining up the expectation with reality is really important. And so, I think that's where I've, had, maybe a lot of heartburn in the past on different places is when the, the expectation doesn't meet with what you talked about in the beginning. And so, you know, oh yeah, we're going to, work 5 days a week and it ends up being seven. Or, you're going to get 2 weeks vacation, but, we don't really keep track of that. But, when we're not busy, you can have that 2 weeks vacation and you just end up, sacrificing your family and different things. And so then you get burnt out a lot quicker.
Rachel, as we talk about this and getting the right atmosphere to attract and retain employees, do you have any tips for that employee to make sure that they're asking the right questions of the person that's hiring them to make sure that it's going to be a good match on both sides?
Yeah, I would give the advice that I just gave one of my students the other day, and that is to really be authentic. And I think as students, they're going to have to do some intentional exploration as to what their values are. Maybe the new employee coming out doesn't really know what they're wanting and what they're valuing, or those values are going to change over time. Maybe they start off as a single person with one set of values. And then as they move into a family, get married, have children, those values are going to change. So I think I would challenge that new employee to really, or I guess the new person entering the workforce, to really be self-reflective intentionally and to do that process over and over. And then as they're in a job, if they see something that gives them that little twinge of, ooh, I'm not sure I like that, they can make sure that that goes into their list of the values that they're going to intentionally seek out the next time that they're looking for a job. Is I really, I want more of this that gave me that satisfaction, that helped me feel fulfilled, and I want less of this that gave me a twinge and a little bit of a concern. So I think it's going to be an ongoing process potentially for you to really identify what are your values and what speaks to you and what you find important and fulfilling within the workplace.
And of course, Rachel comes to this talking students as you're the program lead with the Dan Scott Ranch Management Program and dealing with some of those graduates. But this could be across the board for employees of any age entering into a position. Chris, we've got this person hired. We think that their values align up with what we've got going on. Let's talk about how to make sure that they're integrated well, not only into the ranch, but also into the community. What does that look like in practice?
You know, some of the best, I guess, onboarding experiences that I've had is I've had my boss who is very familiar with the area, and it doesn't have to be your boss. If it's somebody, another employee that's really familiar with the area, take you around town, introduce you to, the parts store, the vet, different vendors, show you where the school's at, churches, those kind of things. And then also inform you about community events, let you know like when different community events are happening so that you can and give you the time to be able to, take off and go to those things to get into the community and maybe even introduce you to some other, ranch employees around. I think sometimes, there's this stigma, of I don't want them to talk to the other ranchers because then they might want to go over there or something like that. But, getting them integrated into that ranch community and brandings or helping other neighbors and stuff, it's really important to make you feel part of that community. And I think, especially for you, but if you're married and kids, having a different spouse take your wife or kids, around and show them and introduce them to some people as well. That is a huge deal. And because it can be so lonely for a wife and kids out on a ranch when the guy's gone so many hours a day.
I'm thinking these are great lessons even for just local chambers to realize too. In a rural community of under 3,000 people, we see it often. A spouse will come in because they'll get a position at the hospital or with the railroad. And for the other partner, it's hard for them to grab a hold of community while that person is gone. And even for somebody who might be new and single and fresh into like a wildlife or a government land position locally, it's hard for them to find community. So yeah, being the person that ushers that in and realizing that that's important for them to build that group around them if you want them to stick around.
Just to build on that just a little bit, I think so often we underestimate the value of the spouse and the kids, the rest of the family, and their happiness. If they're not happy, it's not going to work. And so their happiness is key. And so just concentrating more on that end of things can really have a huge impact, making them feel welcome. And just even you know, like Christmas time, if you do coats or different things, getting all the kids a hoodie or, just making them feel like they're part of the team is huge.
I'm just thinking about students who have gone on internships and the things that they appreciate about being part of that. Housing is a big deal that for as far as satisfaction for the students, is it proximity? Is it close? Is there events or I mean, do the employees get together? Are they open? Is there a culture of teaching the new person different skills that they know that they're lacking in, trying to bring them in and increase their skills and help them to be an even bigger part of the team. Those are things that make a lot of difference. And then, boy, they want to know. They want to know why we're doing things. They want to be part of it. It's not just you do what you're told when you're told. They want to understand, how does what I'm doing right now, even if it seems like a really menial task, fit into the overall vision of this operation and to fit into the overall success. Takes a little bit more effort on the manager's part. And this is where I'm curious about Chris, having sat in both the employee and the manager role, to talk about, what does that look like from an employee? What does that mean for you when someone brings you meaningfully into the conversation of why we're doing something and how it contributes to overall success? But then on the manager side, the flip side, like, how hard is that to bring other people into that conversation and to open it up and, for input that maybe is maybe not the best, maybe doesn't help in some ways?
As an employee, being able to be involved in the decisions and being, feeling like you're being heard and appreciated, with your thoughts and ideas. I mean, it means a lot. And especially if those ideas are put into action and they actually work, it really makes you feel like you're contributing something. And on the flip side, as a manager, usually there's no shortage of ideas. And sometimes I think it's hard because at the end of the day, the decision falls on you as the manager and you have to answer for that. You're not going to just, say, well, so and so thought this would be a great idea, so we tried it and it didn't work. I think the most important thing you can do is to allow your employees, and when I've seen the most success is when I've allowed employees to make those decisions and to take those ideas and put them into action, and try them out on a small scale, and then we can grow it. And I think that's kind of a key, is like, you start off, say, that's a great idea, we should try it and do this. Or maybe it's an idea that doesn't align with our mission and vision. And then you can explain, you take that time to build that culture and say, I see where you're coming from, but unfortunately for us, this isn't going to work because we have to follow this line here. And I think just trying to build that culture both ways is super important. And it is hard as a manager, because especially when you answer to an owner and, they're like, well, why do we have that small group of goats over there, And well, we're going to try some weed control, and be able to explain that as well. So.
Chris, I'm seeing some parallels in that answer to also succession planning and having a ranch that has multiple generations on it. So let's call the parental generation G1 and the kids G2. But very often G1 will question whether or not G2 has business savvy or any interest in management decisions. G2 might have ideas like what you're talking about that they want to bring forward, but they just haven't had that open dialogue with G1 to feel like they're going to be open-minded, they're going to listen. So I guess some advice that you might have for how to approach those conversations when you are either the second generation or you are the employee that might have a thought. How do you bring that up to a manager or a parent or a boss?
Yeah, that's hard. And I've seen it go sideways a lot, and it is hard for, those G1 folks to let go, and allow some of those different things to flourish, really. But as for, approaching somebody, I think it's just really important to sit down and just talk and say, you know, um, I've been here a while, whether it's, a family member or an employee. And, as I've observed some things, here's some things that I've seen that, I feel like could maybe stand to be changed a little bit. How would you feel about, making a couple of small changes? I think sometimes we get this idea, our ideas have to be these big, grand, altering things. And then when we bring these big things up, then it's like, whoa, that's a lot. Instead of, just trying a couple of small things. Like, for instance, I've seen that this meadow could really benefit from some intensive grazing. How would you feel about, if I did it on my own, uh, just fencing off and taking a small group of animals and just intensively graze it for the next couple of years and just see what it does, see if it makes an improvement.
Chris, I have a question on that one too, though. I mean, when I advise my students to act like 4-year-olds and to ask questions, right? Ask why and to kind of dig into it while they're in internships. But at the same time, there's a flip side of that as far as a little bit of fatigue on a manager's side or even feeling threatened by asking why you're doing things or if they can do something new. Can you talk about that and if that is something that pervades some ranch culture and how we can continue to foster learning without walking into any type of a threatening
Yeah,
situation?
that, and especially in the ranching world, it's tough. I remember cowboying on some bigger outfits, and you're wanting so much, so hard. You want to do a good job, right? And you want to be a good cowboy. And so, you're wondering what you're doing the next day. You want to get the right horse. If it's going to be a long day, you don't want to take a colt, or if you're going to be roping stuff, you don't want to take a horse you haven't roped off of yet and, feel like an idiot. And so, you'd ask your boss, hey, what are we doing tomorrow? Say cowboy, and it just like deflates you because you have no idea what you're going to be doing. And so you're trying to guess. And so, it is really hard as an employee when that culture and that tone is set to be able to ask those questions and feel like you can ask. And so I think, being approachable as a manager is really important. At the same time, as a manager, you get a lot of that stuff that can feel like a lot. And, I think, feeling threatened, it does happen, but you have to, as a manager, you have to learn how to be comfortable in your role and know that you were hired for that job and that, if somebody came and took it, it's because you're not doing a good job. It's not because they're better than you necessarily. And so I guess just being comfortable in your role and being able to approach them and say, I think that's, a great idea. Let's talk about it later or, table it for now, just being able to control some of that and say, how about in our weekly meeting, you bring up a few of the things that you're wondering why we're doing that, and we can go through that as it pertains to the ranch. And instead of every time I ask you to do a project, you're asking why, just go do it. And then we can talk about it once a week.
Why, why? That's the great 4-year-old question, Rachel.
Yeah. When will we be there?
Yeah.
So I'm curious, as you just described somebody that's a boss who's not giving clear direction as to what to expect from day to day. Obviously, that's somebody that's likely going to see a high turnover. They're probably somebody that has that revolving door that we're trying to avoid or trying to learn how to avoid in this podcast. So, Chris, what are some red flags? What are some things that maybe a boss might see from their employees that could signal to them that they're not doing things quite right as the employer?
Yeah, I think, um, when employees start shutting down and stop asking questions, that's a huge red flag. I think when you send them out to do tasks and maybe the quality of that task has gone downhill or they're not following through with everything. So, for instance, if you send them around a pasture to check the fence and then, you're out there and you see that, yeah, the fence is up, but it's not quite as tight and, not every staple's been put in like it used to be, just that quality of workmanship falling down. I think, those communication lines start failing. That's a huge red flag. And, sometimes you can start feeling a little bit of resentment. I had an employee that I'd given a lot of rain to one time and too much, and I had disconnected too much. And, I remember one day I was just joking around with him and said, something about, time off. And like he kind of gave a snarky remark to me about, not having enough time off. And so like I caught that right away and I'm like, oh, I'm I'm pushing him too hard. And so, it's just something, you can sense it. And, I think a lot of times that's kind of the downward spiral is both parties can sense something is wrong and there's some tension. And instead of talking about it and trying to figure it out, it just polarizes them more and more until the person ends up leaving. And so I think when you catch it early, I've had a lot of conversations with employees and said, hey, something feels a little off. Did I say something that, or have I done something that you feel isn't quite right? Let's talk about it. And I'd really like to learn more about what's going on and just really be humble and approach it from that and really be authentic and trying to fix it and solve the problem. Sometimes you can't, but sometimes, it's something that you're doing and you can fix it.
So, one of the things that we're going to talk about in a future episode is burnout and overwhelm for employees, which, as you're saying the symptoms, Chris, of kind of this person that's starting to retreat, some of that does feel very similar to burnout. So, do you approach them the same? Is there a difference from a managerial perspective?
I don't think so. I think just being connected with your employees and recognizing when, things are changing, when they feel different. And, one day is not something to be alarmed about. We all have bad days, but when you start seeing patterns and just checking in with them, and I think, especially as the employee is there longer, once an employee's been there, 6 months or a year, one thing that I really like to do that I think is really helpful is stay interviews. I ask the employee, why do they like to work here? What is it that they enjoy? What are some things that they'd like to change? And I think one of the most valuable questions you can ask an employee is, what are some of the talents that you have that you don't feel like you're being able to use right now? And I think that's so important because when an employee doesn't feel like they're utilizing their full potential, like, then they start not feeling as valued. And so if you can capitalize some of those talents in making them feel like their role is more beneficial, I think it's a huge game changer.
I love the idea of the stay interviews, Chris, and like you say, and especially what talents are you not being used? Because if you don't feel like you're being utilized to your full potential, then you're probably shopping around for somewhere that you might be able to use those talents or
Right,
develop.
exactly. And that doesn't come after a month or, or 2 months, I mean, it takes time to understand, what your role is and then what is missing there. But I think after 6 months or a year, those are definitely questions you can start asking.
Well, and a stay interview is a really intentional tactic on a manager's part to try to keep that culture positive. Can you tell me something? What are some other really intentional tactics on a manager's part that you use to create culture? Because there's culture there. It's like in your fridge. There's culture there. Are you growing it intentional are you just letting that culture happen? And as managers coming into places, you're inheriting culture that has been there and a
For
reputation too.
sure.
So you have to be really intentional about creating the culture that you want on that ranch. So what are some tactics besides those stay interviews that you use to actually create that culture?
Yeah, so there's a pile of things you can do. I had a boss, Mark Kostler, when I first took over the McMurtry Ranch. It was almost like coming into a fresh ranch. Say that somebody bought a brand new ranch and there's no employees on it, and then you have the job of coming in there and building it up from where it was at. And so he told me, he said, it's up to you to create the culture on the ranch because if you don't do it, your employees will. And I'll promise you, you don't like the culture they create. And so, you have to make sure that you know what your culture is going to be. And then you foster that through, I think weekly meetings are so huge. And maybe they don't have to happen every week, but at least every couple weeks, getting everybody together, having a meeting and then talking about the things that are important, like talking big picture so that everybody understands what are we shooting for and what are our goals and then long-term planning, diving that down to our next week or 2 weeks tasks, just kind of bringing it all in and bringing it down to the base. And I would just like to add, like workplace culture also is how do we do business as a ranch? How do we go about our daily activities, is really a good, definition of that culture. And so that's where people really either thrive or they don't thrive. If they get if they love that day-to-day activity, then that's going to be the right culture for them.
So I'm curious, you brought up the weekly meetings. And again, as I talk about succession planning, this is a huge thing that comes up in succession planning too, is are you having weekly meetings where all of this is being discussed, including the transfer of bank accounts, the transfer of, all of these legal things, but also the transfer of the day-to-day operations and the generational knowledge, that transition knowledge that needs to happen on a ranch. So, Chris, do you have any resources or any tips for people to, if they've never done a meeting, or if they're doing meetings and they think maybe they could be done better, of a format that works good for people, or just kind of, because it's kind of awkward. A lot of ranches haven't had formal meetings a lot. So it's sort of different to get into.
Yeah, I think sometimes you can just start off a little slow and maybe have some tailgate meetings. Sit on the tailgate, or or have a shoot side meeting or something like that. Just to start building that a little bit. And another thing that I've seen has been really helpful is if you know another nearby ranch that is doing those meetings, ask if you can bring your crew along to sit in and, and see how they're doing it. And, there's probably a lot of templates out there and different ideas. It just really depends on the place and, what's going to be, work for your culture. And, I think, um, again, in those meetings, like, it just depends on the culture, how formal or informal they really are. But I think what's important is to make sure that everybody understands that they're important to be to. Because if they're just like, well, you guys can come if you want, nobody's going to come because they're going to be too busy. So make sure that everyone knows that they're important and they need to be on time.
I'm going to flip our conversation now over to if there's different strategies that work for different generations better than for others. And so, Rachel, I'm not calling you old. You have been in your position for a while. You've seen, I don't know how many students come through. Have you seen a change in how they look at what they're expecting from their employer? I mean, when you read all of the information about going through the generations, it used to be punch the clock, get the paycheck. That has moved a bit more on the dial to now really wanting fulfillment, some flexibility. It seems like people are looking at careers and just their jobs with a whole different lens now than they were 15, 20 years ago. You haven't been there that long, but give me your perspective.
I'm glad you qualified that, because I was going to say I haven't been here long enough to be through multi generations of students coming there. But just looking back and comparing my generation, and also within the program, we have a really high enrollment of veterans. And so we have students as old as 39 that are going through the program, and as young as 19 and 20 that are entering the program. So not just the life differences, but also that they've experienced, but also looking at some of those gender differences for sure. Yeah, I have noticed it. It's kind of a crazy analogy, but in my generation, student loans were the norm. Okay, yeah, you need a little money, go get a little student loan, no big deal. And we had the long term effects, but now, so it's my kids, the age of my kids are going through college, and they have a horrible opinion of student loans. They were avoiding them like the plague. So I think the pendulum swings across these generations about, hard work, dedicate yourself to work, and just be there all the time, work your way to success, to really almost the extreme of the work-life balance of, if I'm not happy where I'm at, then it must not be the right fit for me. And the other thing I think that I see too is we've really emphasized, if you love what you're doing, you're never going to work a day in your life. And I call BS on that, because even though I love this job, there are days when it is just a headache slog. And it's going to be that way no matter what you're doing within the work. And I can see some of, I don't want to say this generation, some of the college age students that are my younger generation right now, they run up against some of those slogging hard things and like, oh, well, this must not be a good fit. If I don't easily slide into this, if this is not easily acceptable and right away fits my values, it's not. So I think helping these students, or working through the different generational differences, to say, Well, yeah, what are your absolutes that go against your values? And what are your values? Because there's always gonna be things that are hard or maybe things that aren't attractive, but really that quitting point or that absolute just needs to be a personal value statement. And I think I went way off of course and didn't necessarily answer your question, Haley. I'm good at that.
We all have our talents. No, you got it in there, Rachel. You got it in there. It's just that there has been a little bit of an evolution. And I love that you use that quote about, not working a day in your life because sometimes you still got to do the nitty gritty and it's not all going to be enjoyable, but hopefully the majority of it is. You also made me remember that one that's if you a bad day on vacation is better than a good day at work. And that's the one that I've always called BS on because to me, nothing feels better than a really good day at work. But that might be just my boomer parents pounding that into my brain that this is what you're supposed to seek. So,
Yeah.
Chris, do you have any thoughts on different generations and how to manage them or what expectations you're seeing from them as employees?
Yeah, I think there's always, always friction between generations from the beginning of time, and I think there's just that balance of respecting the older generation and what they've learned and what they know at the same time as, you know, having the courage to, be able to try something new and, talk to them about trying something new and not just taking everything in. I mean, take everything in but not utilizing everything you learn. So there are different ways of doing things and we'll always come up with different ways of doing things. And from the older generation, just recognizing that the younger generation wants to try some new things, or they are different, and allowing them to be different. But I think the hardest part, especially today, is we talk a lot about work-life balance, and it's like this big thing that's so important. And for an older generational person, it's like, what life? Well, it's just work, like work, work, work. And um and so I think it's important that that both sides understand each perspective and that they come up somewhere in the middle that works. And just understanding that the generation coming in needs different things. I saw a post the other day. I think Megan Terry was talking about some things, and she said something to the effect of cell service, internet are no longer just luxuries anymore. They're lifelines. And so just understanding that, like you're not just getting that benefit, but I mean, that's something they need. It's like having, refrigerator in their house, it's something they need. It's not just a luxury.
Absolutely. I'm going to throw a wild card out there, Chris. This is, as we talk about this dynamic of, somebody's mood shifting, or you can kind of feel that. How do you, if somebody may or may not be sour, but they do something improper and need some correction in how they performed a work task, how do you go about that the best way?
Yeah, so that especially being a parent, I think that's been one of the biggest challenges for me. It's really easy for me to, look at something and say, well, it should have been done like this, and why didn't it get done like this? And then get after them about it, right? But I think the right way to do it, the way that I have always, received it the best is to ask questions. Just start by you know, hey, had you, built this gate and, like all of our other gates are built this way, what caused you to want to build a gate this other way? Like I've never seen one built that way before. And maybe they have this really good idea and reason for doing it that way. But if you jump down their throat right away, they're not going to be inventive anymore, and it could have been something really cool that they developed and you just thought you didn't understand it. And so I think asking questions is the key, and just trying to understand. I think Stephen Covey said, try to understand before being understood. I think that's such an important principle, and ways to correct things. And so if they did it wrong, then it gives you an opportunity to understand, well, I didn't explain it good enough, or I didn't show them well enough. And so I need to go back and, help them with this, or, whatever, or I didn't give good enough directions. And so again, taking that ownership on yourself and realizing that, you probably fell short in one way or the other. And so asking questions to find out how you fell short.
Rachel, with a young and impressionable crew that you work with, although I didn't realize that you had some of the older classmates that are veterans and some that are maybe non-traditional students too. But how do you see them best take that constructive criticism?
Well, that varies a lot from student to student. And especially, I'll go back to the whole generational differences. I think that we as parents have not gotten good at giving constructive criticism. It aligns back to, how do I feel as a parent if someone criticizes my kid? Maybe I take that personally. So I have students that don't take constructive criticism well. So we work on that before they go to an internship and try to help them separate that criticism of the performance from criticism of their self. That's the key that I work on is they're criticizing the job. They're not criticizing you as an individual. So making sure that they can separate that from themselves and then try to work on reflection. It's really important that we don't respond to that criticism in the moment emotionally because nobody likes to be criticized. I don't like to be criticized in my old age, right? So have them separate that, feel the feels in the moment, don't respond, or don't react, but later on, go back and reflect on your performance and reflect on the criticism and see where there was valuable lessons to be learned in that criticism. So all the students keep a journal. They're supposed to do that on a daily basis and work through those situations where they may have received negative feedback and try to reflect on that and what value it is and what they can learn from that moving forward. And then also to think about as you move into the shoes of a manager down the road, is there a better way that you could provide feedback? Or was that a really good way, honestly, that you got that feedback? So learning from it, both how do I take it? How do I respond? How do I, swallow my pride and move forward and do better next time? But then also, is there things that could take away from how I felt that will influence how I react as a manager later?
I'm sorry that there is this underlying theme of calling Rachel old on the podcast today.
Just taking the pressure off of me.
Yeah.
I'm the one with all the gray hair here.
So we are almost out of time here, guys. I'll go ahead and just kind of say last call. Chris, is there anything out of this discussion that you wanted to flesh out a little bit more or other points of discussion that you think are pertinent?
I think creating that culture is so important. And just to go along with what Rachel was saying, that, you know, I'll give a couple examples. One, when I worked for Turner's, I remember going down to Vermejo Park Ranch, and they talked about safety culture and how they created this culture of safety. And it wasn't an oppressive culture. It was this, hey, dude, you need to put your safety glasses on. Oh, thanks. Instead of getting mad and like, oh, I don't want to wear those stupid safety glasses. Having that attitude of, oh, thanks, I appreciate you. You want to save my eyes. And then also like that culture of feedback. Brett McCann talked about how I'm trying to remember which ranch he was on, but anyway, they would go move cows, and every time they would get done moving cows, they would have a debrief, everybody, and they would talk about what went well, what didn't go well, and they would call each other out, like, hey man, you weren't in the right spot or whatever. And that could go to the boss, it could go to anybody. And just having that culture of, you know, giving each other feedback and pointers and seeing things like that, but not doing it in a mean way, but just saying like, hey, we can do better together. And the only way we can do better is if we each can give that feedback to each other. And I think just building that culture in that you're not threatened by feedback, even as the manager, giving those opportunities to say, hey, how am I doing as your boss? What can I do better? What's going well? What do you like? What don't you like? And just building that culture, and I think is so important. And, you know, knowing that culture again, building that and reinforcing it, you're going to keep your employees a lot longer, and they're going to be happier, and their families are going to be happier.
Rachel, anything to add from you?
I agree with what Chris said. And if I go back to that first description of what culture is, after our conversation, I think I would redescribe that as just the norms of behavior. What is normal in that behavior and is viewed as acceptable or viewed as unacceptable? And as Chris so importantly said earlier, that is up to you as a manager to create that culture of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable behavior, because people will create that for you in the absence of that. And then just rewarding, well, it's normal to get feedback here and it's not bad and it feels okay. Just to create that openness, that atmosphere where that kind of effort to lift all ships simultaneously is normalized. It's a very intentional and effort on the part of the manager, something they're going to have to work on continuously, I would imagine.
Thank you for tuning into the Ranch Workforce Project. Still coming up in this limited series podcast, we're going to discuss burnout, what it looks like, what to do once it shows up, and hopefully how to prevent it. We're also going to talk about compensation. What are we paying these employees, both traditionally and creatively? It's all coming up right here on the Ranch Workforce Project, a collaboration of the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance and the Dan Scott Ranch Management Program at Montana State University. If you're enjoying this series, please make sure to share it with a friend, write a review, and of course, subscribe to our podcast. Thanks for listening.